The woman who stopped me in the church parking lot wasn't crying. That's what I remember first. Everyone else who'd come to my father's funeral had done some version of the wet-eyed apology, the hand on my shoulder, the "I'm so sorry for your loss" in the voice people use when they don't know what else to say. This woman just looked at me the way a teacher looks at a student who's about to be told something important. "You don't know me," she said, "but your father did." She was maybe 70, in a charcoal coat that didn't match the rest of the small Iowa town we were standing in. Her hair was pulled back tight. She wore one ring, a thin gold band, and no makeup that I could see. Behind her, the last of the mourners were getting into their cars. The wind was doing what April wind does in Cedar Rapids, which is to say it was cutting. I was going to come inside, she said. I changed my mind. I didn't want to make it about me. I didn't know what to say to that, so I just nodded. She pressed a folded piece of paper into my hand. It wasn't a business card. It was an index card. It was an index card, the kind my father used to keep in his shirt pocket, ruled on one side, blank on the other. There was a phone number written on it in pencil. A Boston area code. Below it, 3 words. Ask for Eleanor. Call her tomorrow, the woman said. Not today. Today you should rest. Tomorrow morning. Tell her Walt's daughter is here. She didn't wait for me to answer. She walked past me to a black sedan parked at the curb, got in the passenger side, and the car pulled away. There was a driver. I noticed that. Whoever she was, she'd been driven. I stood there with the index card in my palm until my mother-in-law came out of the church and asked if I was okay. I said yes, because that's what you say. I put the card in the inside pocket of my coat next to a half-pack of tissues, and I didn't tell anyone about it for the rest of the afternoon. My father was 68 when he died. He had been a high school custodian for 41 years. Roosevelt's High in Cedar Rapids, the same building my brother and I had both graduated from, although my father had worked there longer than either of us had been alive. He retired 3 years ago. They had a little reception for him in the cafeteria, sheet cake from Hy-Vee, punch in a plastic bowl, a framed certificate the principal handed him with both hands. My father wore the same brown sport coat he wore to every wedding and funeral he ever attended, and he looked, in the photo I still have on my refrigerator, mildly embarrassed to be the centre of anything. He died of a heart attack on a Sunday morning while shoveling snow off the neighbour's driveway. The neighbour was 79 and recovering from hip surgery. My father had been doing her driveway for 2 winters without telling her he was doing it. She thought it was the city. She found him at the bottom of the driveway with the snow shovel still in his hand, and she called 911 from her landline because she still had a landline, and by the time the ambulance got there he was already gone. That was a Sunday in late March. The funeral was the following Saturday. My brother flew in from Phoenix on Thursday and was already talking about flying back on Sunday by the time he landed. My brother is 38. He sells software, or he sells something to people who buy software. I have never quite understood his job, and I have stopped asking. He drives a Tesla. He's been married twice. He calls our mother on Mother's Day and on her birthday, and he called our father, by my count, maybe 4 times a year, usually around tax season, when he had a question about a deduction. He loved our dad. I want to be fair. He just loved him at a distance, and from a distance our father looked like a man who'd done less than he had. My brother was the one who, on the morning of the funeral, asked me what Dad had left behind. He said it just like that, over coffee in our mother's kitchen, with the casserole dishes from the neighbours stacked on the counter behind him. What did he leave behind? He left a wife, I said. You know what I mean? I did know what he meant. I just didn't feel like answering. My father's estate was not a mystery. He had a will. He had updated it 5 years before he died, when he'd had the chest pains the first time, and the cardiologist had given him the talk about what people his age should think about. The will was 3 pages. The house, which he had bought in 1983 and finished paying off in 2014, went to my mother. His truck, a 2009 Ford Ranger with 174,000 miles on it, went to my brother, who I knew for a fact would sell it the minute the title cleared. His tools, which were in the garage, and which he had collected over 50 years of small repairs and side jobs, went to me. There was a savings account with $8,400 in it. There was a checking account with $1,200. There was a small life insurance policy through the school district that paid out $25,000, and that was earmarked for the funeral, and whatever was left over went to my mother. That was it. That was what my father had to show. On paper, for 41 years of being the first person at the school every morning and the last person to leave at night. That night, after my brother had finally gone to bed in our old upstairs room and my mother had taken a Tylenol PM and lay down on the couch with the TV still on, I sat at the kitchen table and pulled out the index card. The number didn't look like a doctor's office. There was no extension. There was no name printed anywhere except the name written in pencil. I almost didn't call. I told myself she was probably some old family friend my father had known from the Knights of Columbus or the bowling league or one of the half-dozen other quiet things my father had done with his Saturday afternoons. I told myself I was tired and grieving and inventing meaning where none existed. The woman at the funeral had been nobody, just somebody he'd known once, and the card was nothing. But I'd seen the way she stood. The way she'd waited for the cars to leave before she'd approached me, the way she'd been driven there. I dialed the number at 8 the next morning. A woman answered on the third ring. "Eleanor Voss," she said. That was the name. "I want to be specific about that." She gave her full name when she answered the phone the way a lawyer does or a doctor. "My name is—" I started, and then I couldn't think of how to say it. I said my father's name instead. "I'm Mort Pasternak's daughter. A woman at the funeral yesterday gave me this number. She said—" "Yes." She didn't let me finish. "Yes, I know who you are. Your father told me about you." There was a pause then, long enough that I checked to make sure the call hadn't dropped. "I'm very sorry about your father," she said. "He was a good man. I'd like you to come to Boston, if you're able. There are some things he wanted me to explain to you in person." "Boston," I said. "It's where we're located. I can arrange your travel if that's a concern." "Located," I said. I felt slow. "I'm sorry. Located as what? Are you a lawyer?" "I'm an attorney, yes, but that isn't what this is about, or it's only part of what this is about, or it's only part of what this is about." She paused again. I could hear her breathing, the careful way of someone who was thinking about how much to say on a phone call. "Your father wanted me to give you something in person. He was very specific about that. Can you come this week?" I said I could. I didn't know yet that I could, but I said yes anyway. We agreed on Wednesday. She gave me an address on Beacon Hill, which I wrote down on the back of a Target receipt that was on the table. I hung up. My mother was still asleep on the couch. My brother was upstairs, probably already on his laptop. I sat in the kitchen and looked at the address and tried to make it mean something, and I couldn't. My husband watched our daughter that Wednesday. I told him I had to fly out for something to do with my dad's estate, and I would explain when I got back. He's a good man, and he didn't push. He drove me to the Eastern Iowa airport at 4 in the morning and kissed me at the curb and said, "Whatever it is, you don't have to handle it alone." And I said, "I know," and we both knew I was lying a little, but it was the kind of lie you tell when you're trying to get through something. The flight to Boston was 2 stops. I got there a little after 1 in the afternoon. The address Eleanor Voss had given me was a brownstone on a street that sloped down toward the common. It looked like nothing from the outside. There was a small brass plate by the door that said, "Voss and Lindgren, Trust Counsel." I rang the bell. A young man in a sweater answered and led me up a narrow staircase to the 2nd floor without asking me my name, which told me he had been expecting me. Eleanor Voss was in her 60s, grey hair cut short, glasses on a chain around her neck, a navy blazer over a white shirt. Her office was small. There was a window that looked out at a brick wall across the alley. There were 3 plants on the windowsill, and a desk that had been used hard for a long time. She stood up when I came in. She held out her hand. She had a firm handshake, dry skin, the grip of a woman who had spent her life shaking hands with people and meaning it. "Thank you for coming on short notice," she said. "Please, sit." She sat across from me, not behind the desk, but in the chair next to mine, which I noticed, and which I think she meant me to notice. "I'm going to start at the beginning," she said. "Your father came to me in 1996. He drove out here. He didn't fly. He'd never been on an airplane in his life, and he wasn't going to start. He came here because a man named Daniel Pruitt, who'd been your father's commanding officer in the army in the late 70s, had given him my name. Daniel and I had grown up together. Your father drove 1,400 miles to ask me a question." She paused. She let me sit with that for a moment. "He asked me how a person of modest means could quietly do good for the rest of his life without anyone, including his family, knowing about it. I didn't say anything. I think I was waiting for her to laugh, or to say something that would make the floor feel solid under me again. He told me what he had. He had about $11,000 saved up. He'd been investing it on his own, slowly, since he was 26, in companies he'd researched at the public library after work. He kept his notes in a spiral notebook. He had picked 4 companies in the early 80s because he thought their products were honest and they treated their employees decently, and he had put every spare dollar into those 4 stocks for 15 years. By 1996, that $11,000 had grown into something he didn't quite know what to do with. "How much?" I said. My voice didn't sound like my voice. At that meeting in 1996, his portfolio was worth a little over $400,000. 400,000. That was 1996. He hadn't told your mother. He wasn't sure he ever would. He wasn't sure what it was for yet. He just knew he didn't want it to change the way he lived, and he didn't want it to change the way his family saw him. She paused. "He told me he liked who he was when he didn't have it. He didn't want to become a man with it." I was looking at the plants on the windowsill. I don't know why. I needed something to look at that wasn't her. "He set up a trust," she said. "A charitable trust with very specific parameters. He named it after his mother, the Hannah Pasternak Fund. He wanted it to do 3 things. He wanted it to pay the property tax bills of widows in Lynn County who were at risk of losing their homes. He wanted it to cover the cost of GED test fees and 1 year of community college tuition for adults over 30 who hadn't finished high school. And he wanted it to provide a flat $10,000 to any custodial worker in the Cedar Rapids public schools whose family had a medical emergency that wasn't covered by insurance." She stopped. She looked at me. "He has done these things for 28 years. Quietly, the fund has paid out to over 600 families. As of the last quarter, the fund itself is valued at $3,600,000. Most of that growth has been organic. He continued to add to it in small amounts every year. His last contribution was in January. She let me sit. She was good at letting people sit. 3 million, I said. The number didn't fit in my mouth. 3.6. She said it gently, not correcting me, just being precise the way I think she was always precise. "Why didn't he tell us?" I didn't make it a question. She answered it anyway. "He told me once that he was afraid of what it would do to your brother. I'm sorry to say that. He didn't say it cruelly. He said it the way a father says something he's been thinking about for 30 years. He said he loved your brother, and he didn't trust him with the knowledge of it. He said he could imagine the conversations he'd have to have. He could imagine the way it would feel to say no. He said he didn't want the rest of his life to be a series of arguments about money." "And me?" I said. "You." She looked at me carefully. "He said you were the one he was going to leave it to. He said you'd been making your own decisions about money since you were 19, and you'd never once asked him for any. He said you'd take care of it. He said you understood what it was for. I wasn't crying. I want to be honest about that. I think I was past crying. I was somewhere underneath crying, in the place where the body decides it can't afford the energy." She slid a folder across the desk. Inside were the trust documents, the IRS filings, the annual disbursement reports going back to 1998. There were letters, many letters. Letters from women who had been able to stay in their houses. Letters from a 44-year-old man who had finally finished his GED and then his associate's degree and was now teaching first grade. letters from a custodian whose daughter had needed a kidney transplant and whose family had been able to afford the parking at the hospital and the meals and the lost shifts because of a $10,000 check that had arrived without a return address. None of them said my father's name. None of them knew. The checks came from the Hannah Prastanak Fund, signed by Eleanor Voss as trustee. He wanted you to read the letters, she said. He was specific about that. Before we discussed anything else, he said you wouldn't believe the size of it without the letters. I read them. I sat in that small office on Beacon Hill, and I read every letter in the folder, and there were maybe 60 of them, the ones Eleanor had selected, and at some point I started crying and I didn't stop for a while. Eleanor got up at one point and put a box of tissues on the corner of the desk near me and went back to her chair without saying anything. When I could talk again, I said, "What does he want me to do with it?" "He wants you to keep it going." She said it simply. The trust has its own structure. You don't have to do it alone. I'll remain as trustee for as long as you need me to. There's a small board of advisors he selected, 3 people, all of whom knew him in some capacity. They handle the application review. Your job, if you accept it, is to be the steward of his intent, to say yes to the things he would have said yes to say no when no is the right answer, to add to it when you can, to find people who need what it does and to make sure they get it. She paused. He left you a letter. I haven't read it. I was instructed not to. She handed me an envelope. My father's handwriting was on the front, to my daughter. I didn't open it there. I knew I couldn't. I put it in my bag. Eleanor walked me to the door of the brownstone. She shook my hand again. She said, "Take some time. There's no rush on any of this. Call me when you've read the letter." I walked down to the Boston Common and sat on a bench and watched a man feed pigeons for a while before I went back to the hotel. I opened the letter in the hotel room. I want to tell you what it said, and I can because I've read it so many times. I know it by heart now. He wrote that he was sorry for not telling me sooner. He wrote that he had thought about telling me 100 times, and every time he'd decided that what he wanted me to have was not the money but the example. He wrote that he had grown up watching his own father work himself into an early grave for nothing but the rent, and that he had decided, somewhere in his early 20s, that he was going to live small and do something with what he saved. He wrote that the size of the fund had surprised him too. He wrote that there were years he thought about dissolving it and just giving us all the money and going on a vacation for once. And he wrote that every time he'd thought that, he'd remembered the first letter he'd ever gotten back, from a widow named June, whose property tax bill the fund had paid in 1999, and he put the spreadsheet back in the drawer and gone to bed. He wrote that he was leaving it to me because he trusted me. That was the line that broke me. "I'm leaving it to you because I trust you to know what it's for." He wrote that he loved my brother. He wrote that he loved my brother in a way that had hurt him for a long time, because he knew my brother thought he had been a small man. He wrote that he hoped, someday, after some time had passed, I would find a way to tell my brother what he had done, and he hoped my brother would come to understand that quiet didn't mean small. But he wrote that he didn't want me to tell my brother right away because he was afraid the foundation would become an argument before it could become a peace. He wrote, "Let him grieve me first. Let him grieve me first. Let him grieve the man he thought I was. Then, if it feels right, show him who I actually was." He wrote at the end, "Don't make this your whole life. Make it the part of your life that's mine." I flew home the next morning. I didn't tell my brother right away. I didn't tell my husband everything either, but I told him most of it, and he sat with me on the back porch and held my hand and didn't try to give me advice. My daughter was 4. I told her grandpa had left me a job to do. She accepted, that the way 4-year-olds accept everything. I waited 2 months. I waited because I wanted to be sure, and because I wanted my brother to have time to actually miss our father. Before money entered the room, he called me in late May. He was in Phoenix. He said he'd been thinking. He said he'd been short with me at the funeral, and he wanted to apologize. He said he kept catching himself wanting to call Dad about something stupid, a question about his lawnmower, and then remembering. He cried on the phone, which my brother almost never does, and I sat in my car in a parking lot and listened to him cry, and I almost told him then. I waited another week. I flew to Phoenix on a Friday. I told him I had something to discuss in person. He picked me up at Sky Harbor and we drove to his house, which was big and beige and quiet, and his second wife had taken their daughter to her parents for the weekend, which I'd asked him to arrange. I told him everything at his kitchen counter. I told him about the woman at the funeral. I told him about Eleanor Voss. I told him about Boston. I told him the number, and I told him the years, and I told him what the trust did and what it had done, and what our father had built with his free time over 41 years of mopping floors. He didn't say anything for a long time. He got up. He walked over to the sink. He put both hands on the counter and looked out the window at the backyard, where there was a pool and some palm trees and a stretch of perfect grass that had cost more to maintain in a year than our father had spent on his entire wardrobe. "Why didn't he tell me?" he said. "He thought you would have asked for some of it." "I would have." He said it quickly before he had time to dress it up. "I appreciated that. I would have asked for help with the second divorce. I would have asked for help with the second divorce. I would have asked for help when I got laid off in 2018. I would have asked." He shook his head. He knew. He knew. He let me think he was poor. "He was poor," I said. "He chose to live like he was poor. There's a difference." My brother turned around. His face was wet. He hadn't cried at the funeral. He hadn't cried in front of me since we were children. "I told the guys at work he was a janitor, like it was a joke," he said. "Like, my dad was a janitor, and he raised us on nothing. Can you believe I made it out? I told that story for 20 years. I know. And he was sitting on $3 million and giving it to widows. He was sitting on it and giving it to widows." He laughed. It wasn't a happy laugh. It was the laugh you do when a thing is so big you have to make a sound or you'll break. "What's he want from me?" he said. "He didn't want anything from you. He wanted you to know. Eventually. He left it to me because he knew I wouldn't fight it, and he wanted you to have time to miss him before you found out. He didn't trust me." "He loved you," I said. "He didn't trust you with this. Those aren't the same thing." He sat down on a stool at the kitchen counter. He looked at his hands. "What do you want me to do?" he said. "Nothing. Right now. I just wanted you to know. I didn't want there to be a thing I knew that you didn't." He didn't want that either in the end. "I'm not going to sue you," he said, like he had to say it out loud to make sure he wouldn't. "I know." I thought about it for about 2 seconds just now. "I want you to know that." I thought, well, that's an estate, I said, and there should have been disclosure, and I could probably... He stopped. He pressed his palms into his eyes, and then I remembered who he was, and I thought, Jesus Christ, what is wrong with me? "You were scared," I said. "Money makes everyone scared. He'd be so disappointed in me right now." "He'd be proud of you," I said. "He'd be proud of you for stopping at 2 seconds." I stayed with my brother that weekend. We went through old photos. He told me a story about Dad teaching him to drive in the high school parking lot that I'd never heard. I told him about reading the letters in Eleanor's office. We ate take-out pizza on his back patio on Saturday night, and we talked about our father the way we should have been talking about him for years. Before I flew home on Sunday, my brother said, "If you ever need help with the fund, I want to help. Not money. I have nothing to add. But if there's ever a thing to do, call me." I said I would. That was almost 2 years ago now. My brother has called me almost every Sunday since. He has not asked me for anything. He has flown out twice to spend time with our mother, who has slowed down some, but who is doing all right. Last summer he came to Cedar Rapids, and we drove out together to the cemetery and stood there for a while without saying anything. And on the way back to my mother's house he said, "I think I owe Mrs. Petrova a snow shovel," and we both laughed for the first time in a long time. The Hannah Pasternak Fund is still operating. We paid out 41 disbursements in the last fiscal year. There's a woman named Rosa in Cedar Rapids who got her GED in November at age 52 and who I will never meet. And there's a high school custodian named Greg whose son's leukemia treatment is being paid for in part by a check that arrived in his mailbox in October without explanation. There's a notebook on my desk now where I keep the names. My father's notebook is in a drawer. I haven't combined them. They feel like they should stay separate. My daughter is 6. She asks me sometimes what I'm working on when I'm at my desk in the evening. I tell her I'm working on Grandpa's project. She doesn't ask what the project is. She is at the age where the answer Grandpa's project is enough, and I am at the age where I am grateful for that, because I am still figuring out how to explain it. I will tell her eventually. I will tell her that her grandfather was a man who mopped floors for a living, and who, in the quiet hours between 5 in the morning and 7 in the morning, when the school was empty and the heat hadn't kicked on yet, read the Wall Street Journal at the front desk in the lobby. I will tell her that he wore the same brown coat to every funeral he ever attended. I will tell her that he saved his change in a jar on the dresser, and that he never bought a new car, and that he gave away $3.5 million in someone else's name. I will tell her that he didn't tell us, because he was afraid of what it would do to us, and that he was probably right about my uncle, and probably wrong about me, but I forgave him for that a long time ago. I will tell her that the people we lose are usually larger than we thought they were, that the small-seeming lives are sometimes carrying entire towns on their backs, that a man who looks like he has nothing might just be holding it all somewhere else, in trust, for the people he'll never meet. If your father wore the same coat to every wedding, if your mother kept a notebook by the bed, if your grandparents drove a car for 20 years and never complained, sit with that for a minute. Look at the small things they kept. Look at the drawers they organized. There might be more there than you know. Call them. If you still can, read what they leave you. All of it. The quiet ones are not the small ones. I know that now. I wish I'd known it sooner. And I wish I'd asked my father, just once, while he was alive, what he was thinking about when he sat at the kitchen table on Sunday nights with his coffee and his spiral notebook, because I think now he might have told me. I think he was waiting for me to ask. If someone in your life is sitting at a kitchen table on a Sunday night with a notebook and a cup of coffee, go sit with them. Ask them what they're working on. You might be surprised by the answer. I was. I've thought about my father almost every day since I sat in Eleanor Voss's office on Beacon Hill and read those letters from people who didn't know his name. What I keep coming back to is this. He chose the man he wanted to be when he was 26 years old, and he kept choosing him every single morning for the next 42 years. That's the part I can't get over. Not the money. The repetition. The decision he must have made again and again at the kitchen table with his coffee, that today he was going to remain the kind of man who didn't need to be seen. My brother once called Dad a small man behind his back, and I heard him do it, and I didn't correct him because I didn't know how. I know now. A small man would have spent the money. A small man would have wanted credit. A small man would have looked at $3.5 million and seen what it could buy him, instead of what it could quietly do for a widow he was never going to meet. The thing about cause and effect is that we usually only see one link in the chain. We see a janitor with a Ford Ranger, and we think we've seen the whole life. That every choice my father made in 1984, every spare $20 he put into a stock instead of into a bigger TV, every Sunday morning he sat with a spiral notebook instead of going to a sports bar, those choices compounded. Not just the dollars, the character. By the time he died, he wasn't a man who happened to have money. He was a man so used to not needing money that the money had become someone else's. He had built himself out of 40 years of small refusals, and the fund was just the residue. I think about what he taught me without ever sitting me down. He taught me that integrity is not a feeling you have. It's a thing you do when no one is in the room. He taught me that intelligence is not how clever you sound, it's how patient you can be with a plan that won't pay off for 30 years. He taught me that strength is not how loud you can be in an argument. It's how steady you can be in a snowstorm at 68 years old, shoveling a neighbour's driveway because she needed it shoveled. If you take anything from what I've shared, please let it be this. The people you love are watching you decide who to be. Your children are watching. Your siblings are watching. Some stranger you'll never know is watching. Choose well in the small hours when nothing is on the line, because that's where the life actually gets built. My father did, and I am still learning, very slowly, what he was trying to show me. I hope I have the patience to keep learning.